Good afternoon, everyone. There we go. I want to welcome you to this ITIF event to roll out, I think, certainly a new, but I think pretty intriguing and innovative proposal, if I say so myself, to significantly increase the role of the federal government, particularly through R&D, to help drive U.S. productivity growth. So we have a great panel this morning. I'm going to introduce the panelists. I'm going to turn it over shortly to Bob Bixby for a couple opening remarks. Then I'm going to make some remarks. I'll turn it over to the panelists. We should have plenty of time for questions from you all. We're in the wrong order. Okay, great. So we'll start with Marcus Peacock. Marcus is the COO of the Business Roundtable, which made big news, I guess, 2 weeks ago with the announcement on...
We're making big news all the time.
It's just a minor little detail that corporations should not only be focused on the stock price and the profits, which I thought was a really progressive and important statement. He's an expert on federal regulation and budgeting. He was deputy administrator at the EPA. He was also associate director of natural resources, energy, and science at OMB. I'm doing very abbreviated introductions this morning, and Marcus is really here to talk mostly about kind of the budget implications of what we're talking about. Next is Jeff Patterson. Jeff is the Chief Operating Officer of ASME, which is the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And ASME does a great job of, among other things, educating members of Congress and Hill staff on important technological issues. Prior to that, he was the CEO of Safari Books Online. Celia Merzbacher is the Associate Director of the Quantum Economic Development Consortium at SRI International, aimed at improving and strengthening the U.S. commercial quantum industry. And as we talk about in the report, quantum is going to be one of those technologies going forward that's going to play an important role in driving U.S. productivity and competitiveness. She also was Vice President for Innovative Partnerships at the Semiconductor Research Corporation, and then was also Assistant Director for Technology in the Bush II Office of Science and Technology Policy. Finally, Gil Vandentop is the Director of Corporate University Research Labs at the Intel Corporation. And his team manages Intel's university research investments for key internal technology customers. He's also on the board of the Semiconductor Research Corporation, and prior to his role at Intel Labs, he worked at Intel's manufacturing group's component research group. Am I too tall? So I want to now just turn it over for a couple of minutes to Bob Bixby. Bob is the executive director of the Concord Coalition, and this project really stems from Bob's vision and leadership on this. Bob and the Concord Coalition have commissioned a set of papers that are going to be rolled out in the next 4 to 6 weeks, I believe. And this was the first one to roll out, and he asked ITIF if we would be looking at how we could grow the economy through R&D. So we really want to thank Bob for Concord Coalition support. And Bob, a few words.
Thanks, Rob. I don't think I'll have any problem with the height of the microphone here. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I guess the first question that I should ask is, or answer is, why would the Concord Coalition be interested in spending more on R&D? I think a lot of people think of the Concord Coalition, probably rightly so, as being focused on fiscal responsibility, which we are. However, if you look back at the history and founding of the Concord Coalition, we also talk about economic growth. Because the point of fiscal responsibility, in our view, is that it would promote economic growth over the long term, and that the two things go together, so that what we're interested in is a fiscally responsible economic growth. Why not fiscally irresponsible economic growth and just throw everything that you can at ideas for growth and not worry about the debt? Because after a while, the debt itself and the rising deficits would become a problem, and you're working against economic growth. So You know, when the Concord Coalition started, we talked a lot about the importance of R&D spending. Why? Because R&D spending can enhance productivity, and productivity enhances economic growth. So we are interested in that, and it's not just, you know, anything that goes for economic growth or for R&D spending, but, you know, how can the federal government best target its resources to the types of investments that will have the most bang for the buck? And one of the reasons that I like this paper so much from ITIF is that that's really what that's what we asked them to look at. I think that they did a very good job. So if you look at the budget and R&D, there's been a long-term downward trend on it. When the Concord Coalition started back in 1992, you had about 17% of the budget was considered investment, about a little bit less than 4% of GDP. And we thought it was too low then, but it's gone further now. There are different ways of counting it, but it's you know, about 12% of the budget now, and you know, maybe about 2.5% of GDP. So it feeds into an anti-growth cycle, and part of it is because of the way the budget is constructed. You know, most of the budget is on autopilot. About 61% or so is mandatory spending, entitlement programs, another 7 or 8% is interest on the debt. And so what tends to get squeezed is the R&D spent as research and development, but that's part of the entire domestic discretionary budget. The defense budget is, you know, the two discretionary parts of the budget are only about 30%. And it's easier to cut them, frankly, because the constituencies aren't as powerful, and the spending has to come up for approval every year through the annual appropriations process. So there's a process element here too that works against the R&D spending. Now, is increased R&D spending a panacea for everything? Are we going to grow our way out of the problem? No, I don't think so. The Concord Coalition still believes in hard choices, and you know, spending cuts and tax increases all need to be on the table as far as we're concerned, because we have just an enormous debt-to-GDP ratio problem when you look in the future. And as I said before, that is important because eventually it does have a negative impact on the economy, which is something that CBO has always warned about. So Rob said something about this is part of a project that we're doing. We want to focus on the slowing of the labor force. That's one of the main reasons that economic projections have been so anemic going forward. So we have a paper on increased legal immigration. Politically, good luck with that, but I mean, we have never really been bound by things that are politically saleable, so let's add legal immigration to the mix. But we believe in higher R&D spending to improve productivity. If we don't increase the growth of the labor force and improve productivity, we're really going to be up a creek, because it's very, very difficult to do it all on the side of cutting entitlements and spending taxes, though I reserve the right to say we need to do that too. So with that as an introduction, let me turn things over to Rob, and he can describe his excellent paper, and I'll look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I do want to just, it's one of those moments in Washington you can miss. You know, the Concord Coalition historically has been focused, you know, very much so on raising taxes, cutting spending, getting the budget deficit in order. And I think it's very important that a number of the papers now are talking about a growth component of that now. So it's not that, as Bob said, it's not that these other things aren't important, but there needs to be a growth component to any viable deficit and debt challenge. So why is it a problem? Right now we've got a $16 trillion debt, national debt. It's expected by CBO to go to $29 trillion in 2028. That means the debt-to-GDP ratio is going to go from about 40% in the first part of the second Bush administration up to almost 100% by 2029. And one of the reasons this is getting bad and getting worse is that every day you have 10,000 Americans who retire from the workforce and only about 2,300 who are joining. So every day there's more and more Americans who are essentially dependent on the rest of us who are earning money. And so eventually this has to stop. Herb Stein famously said, if something can't go on forever, it won't. And so at some point, this will have to stop. And what you want to do is you want to stop it the right way, not the wrong way. The wrong way will be default, inflating our way out of the debt, or other kinds of major spending hardships or big draconian tax increases. So it's important to get in front of this. I know that's hard to do sometimes in a short-term environment in Washington. So if we don't want to have to draconically raise taxes or cut spending, growth is a key component of that. Where do we get growth? We can get growth from higher productivity. So if we were to raise productivity, right now productivity meaning the amount of work we produce per hour in this country, the amount of output we produce per hour is growing, according to CBO, estimated growth by 1.4% over the next 30 years. Now you can say, is that a lot or little? Well, in the 90s, we were at about 2.8%. In the 60s, some parts of the 70s, we were at 3.3%. So 1.4% is pretty anemic, really anemic. And so if we grow 1.4%, GDP is expected to be $30 trillion by 2049 in real dollars. Okay, 30 trillion, put that in the back of your mind. Now imagine if we could grow at 3.4%, the rate we had in parts of the 2000s and parts of the 1960s. We would have a GDP of $57 trillion by 2049. In other words, we would create an entire additional U.S. economy and more, not counting population increase. So by 2039, that would lead to an additional $2.4 trillion in federal revenues. The deficit would fall, according to the modeling we've done in this report, from $2.6 trillion to $898 billion, and the debt-to-GDP ratio would go to 157% to 79%. So those are pretty serious numbers. How do we get there? Well, how do we get there is we have to be able to figure out a way to produce more with the same amount of work. There's two ways you can raise productivity. One way is you can use technology to replace work or replace workers. So a good example of that is increasingly when you go to McDonald's or Burger King, there's going to be a robot that's going to be making those hamburgers. Another way is just to reduce the need for output. And I think people miss this one all the time. If you think about the biggest economic impact from autonomous vehicles, it's not going to be increasing taxi driver productivity. It's going to be essentially putting out of business the auto body repair industry, who I visit numerous times a year. Somebody just bashed into the back of our new Jeep. I had to take it in. There's no way that anybody would have bashed into the back of our new Jeep if they had level 4 automation in vehicles. So that's not going to make the auto body repair work that's being done any more efficient, but it will mean that we're doing 90% less of it. And we can take that labor and we can move it into other things that are going to add value. So those are the two ways we can do it. How do we do both of those things? The evidence in economics is crystal clear. There's one of those things when you look at growth accounting and economics, it is unanimous. And the best study on this was by a couple of economists, Kleno and Rodriguez-Clare. They found that 90% of growth in per capita income comes from innovation. 90%. Another study by Harvard, Phil Aghion and Brown University Howitt said, quote, in the long run, all of the growth in output per worker is caused by technological progress. So between 90 and 100% of growth is coming from innovation. And where does technological progress come from? It comes from R&D. So one sort of definitive study by Coe and Heltman at Harvard found that a 1% increase in R&D stock leads to a 0.23% increase in productivity. All right, so you don't need to get on all those numbers. The basic point is we need productivity. It's going to come from technological innovation. That technological innovation is going to come from R&D. Unfortunately, the U.S. government, as Bob alluded to, has been cutting back as a share of GDP its R&D. In the basically between 1960 and 1980, U.S. R&D federal R&D was about 1.5% of GDP. Today, it's about 0.71% of GDP. We are now investing less in R&D in the United States at the federal government level than we did prior to the launch of Sputnik. And Sputnik was this big, everybody talks about the Sputnik moment. That was the Sputnik moment. We decided we were going to lead the world in R&D, and we did. And that's part of the reason why you have companies like Intel on this panel, because we built up a giant base of R&D, and it helped companies then take that and translate it into great innovations and great products. So what should we do? One of the main recommendations of this report is we argue that Congress should increase federal R&D investments by $4 billion a year, every year, until year 10, you're at $40 billion. So 4 more next year, $8 billion the next year, $12 billion the next year. That sounds like a lot, but if we were investing in R&D at the same levels as the early 1980s, we'd have to invest 100 to 130 billion in R&D. So we're only at 40 billion. You're only making up about a third of that delta, of that gap. But the key point of this study is not just simply to say, let's spend more money on R&D, as good as that would be. Rather, as Bob alluded to, it's about trying to target that next marginal dollar to the most important areas of technology that would have the biggest opportunity to impact productivity. One of the most interesting things about this study to me was I looked around the world, pretty much every major country, and said, where is the study that's been done by an OSTP or an equivalent or a congressional advisory body for technology or whatever it might be? Where is the study that says these are the technologies that are most important in driving productivity? And the answer was none. There were no studies. Nobody has looked at this question, which I find relatively intriguing and sort of disturbing, because raising productivity is an important mission, in our view, for productivity. So where would some of these areas be? I think one, and perhaps one of the most important, is robotics. Robotics is going to play a key role in a wide array of sectors, not just in manufacturing and painting cars, but in service sector and healthcare and a wide variety of areas. And yet, we have a national robotics initiative at the National Science Foundation that funds between $30 to $50 million a year. You compare that to what China's investing, and we're talking 2 orders of magnitude difference. Autonomous vehicles, autonomous systems. Again, we've argued that if we could get autonomous vehicles to even level 4, we'd be saving $1 trillion annually in the U.S. economy. AI. AI is an important technology for many of these other technologies, but things like language translation, preventing machine breakdowns, improving industrial design. And yet, we have this view that, well, AI is here, there's no more science to be done, it's just really a question of leaving it up to the companies to implement it. And in fact, I think that's misguided. There's still an enormous amount of research and science that needs to be done in AI. Good quote from Yoshua Bengio, who's probably one of the leading AI scientists. He says, quote, "We need to consider the hard challenges of AI and not be satisfied with short-term incremental advances." So there's a lot more work we need to do in supporting AI research. Some of you may have seen on Tuesday, the White House just announced, Michael Kratios announced it at actually an ITF event, their new funding levels on AI, and we're investing over almost $1 billion, so that's really a good start, but Congress should supplement that. Other areas include additive manufacturing, big opportunities there. There's no reason in 10 to 20 years we shouldn't be. I know this is really important to me because the street I live on, regularly they're tearing down homes and building new ones, and I'm sitting there for 9 months watching these people build a home. I would really love it if they would come in with a 3D printer, print the home, I would come home, it would be done. Now you can laugh at that, but actually people are beginning to think about that. And so 3D printing holds an enormous amount of progress, not just at big scale things, but in metals and a wide variety of other things. Material sciences hold enormous promises. We're talking now about the materials genome. Rust alone costs the U.S. economy $400 billion a year. Self-healing concrete could save billions and billions of dollars a year in road repair. Metamaterials, which are custom-made materials that don't exist in nature. They're talking about turning windows on your office building into solar panels. So again, array of innovations in materials that we could do. Microelectronics and advanced computing, which a couple of folks here will talk about, but high-performance computing, quantum computing, the whole challenge of going what's called beyond Moore. Moore's Law, after the famous Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel. Moore's Law was super important. It's why your cell phone is so much better than the one you got rid of. But that's slowing down now, and it's going to take a lot of technical and scientific advancement to keep us on track. And companies are investing a lot in that, but it's an area where government also needs to backfill with earlier stage basic and early applied research. And finally, life sciences. One study by Murphy and Topel predicted that if we could eliminate heart disease, we'd save $48 trillion. If we could cure cancer, it'd be $47 trillion. So what do we do besides allocating this new money and targeting it towards these kinds of technological areas? First of all, we propose that OSTP, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, should engage industry input to craft a national research roadmap to identify key productivity-enhancing technologies. We've done our part here, but we're not saying it's certainly not comprehensive enough or detailed enough. On the basis of that, agencies would submit budget requests to OMB reflecting how their proposed R&D investments match up to that roadmap. It's similar to the Nanotechnology Initiative that was launched in late stages of the Clinton administration and then followed up in the Bush administration. Congress and the White House should also make it clear that agencies that existing R&D should be focused wherever possible on productivity improvement. Good example of that is NSF's robotics initiative, which is designed to only fund robotics technology that is a complement to a worker, not a replacement to a worker. And I get politically why that's the case, but to me that's way, way too restrictive. You should be funding robotics. It should be funding robotics technology writ large. We should be funding R&D consortia. ITI played a pretty important role in establishing or getting established the 14 Manufacturing USA Institutes. They're funded only at $330 million. We propose they should be funded at over $4 billion a year, and the range of centers should be expanded to cover many more important technologies. So let me just close by saying two things, two concerns I think that come up. One is, that's a lot of money, $40 billion. There's all these other pressing priorities. Can we afford it? What we are able to model that if we invested this $40 billion more and we were only able to raise productivity by 1/10 of 1 percentage point. In other words, instead of the CBO baseline of 1.4, we get it up to 1.5. It would pay for itself in federal budget, in federal tax revenues through the growth matter. So we don't have to get very far for it to be revenue neutral. Anything above 1.5% gets you to a net plus for the federal budget, and then, of course, improves U.S. competitiveness, improves standards of living, improves wages. And then perhaps, and probably the most important concern or criticism of this would be, should we and can we afford higher productivity? Because doesn't that mean workers are going to lose their jobs? And I absolutely think that's a critical question we have to face. But I would encourage us to look at what happened in the 1990s, excuse me. We had about twice as fast productivity in the 90s. The odds of you losing your job in the 90s were higher than they are now. The odds of losing your job today actually are the lowest they've been since BLS counted this back to 95. And yet, most workers were pretty happy. And the reason they were happy was because the economy was growing, unemployment was low, companies were making new investments and adding new jobs, and workers who did lose their job had a much easier time to go and get another job. So I think that's important to remember. And then on top of that, we really have to back this policy agenda up with a serious worker adjustment strategy. That would include, in our view, a national unemployment insurance system that is, if you lose your job because of a technology, you should be able to get income support for 6 months that's viable. We should reform the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act, which helps workers who are lost jobs from trade, turn it into a Trade and Technology Adjustment Assistance Act. I would hate to see us abandon the idea of productivity just because we're concerned about some workers losing their jobs. I think we should be concerned about both, and the way to square that circle is to advance productivity, but at the same time, really step up our game. ITIF released a report last year on how to do that, looking at some of the best practices around the world, like Singapore, which to us is by far the gold standard of how to do this. If you lose your job in Singapore, you really got a system to help you get into the next one. And I understand why workers are concerned here. Last point I'll just make, I was talking to a Swedish labor union official a couple of years ago. He said, in Sweden, we don't worry about our companies installing new technology. What we worry about is them keeping old technology. And I said, why? And he said, because if they keep old technology, they might go out of business because of competition from all around the world. We need our companies to keep modernizing and innovating and investing. And the reason we don't worry about it is because the Swedish system is so good. If you lose your job, you've got a lot of help, a lot of support to jump from one lily pad to the next one and not fall in the pond. So I think that's the vision we have to move towards. So with that, I'll turn it over to Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And is it all right if I do that from here?
Absolutely.
You're not missing much if you can't see me. So I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Business Roundtable, as Rob mentioned. Just a lot of people don't necessarily know Business Roundtable. It's a business association of about 200 CEOs of large, predominantly U.S. companies. And if anybody understands innovation, productivity, where growth comes from, it tends to be our members. And that's the first thing I want to do is emphasize the premise of this report is just exactly bang on. And it always surprises me that while people sort of understand the common sense of that, they don't think about the ramifications of that and where a lot of time and attention of the government should be compared to some other issues. Our standard of living, and as Rob pointed out, including our economic growth, government revenues, are based largely on productivity gains. That's where they come from. And if we did not have productivity gains, half of us wouldn't be here because through most of humankind, life expectancy was 35 years or less, and most of us would be out now looking for nuts and berries to get us ready for the winter. But what do we get productivity from? And predominantly, it's not just solely new technology, but that is the main factor that increases productivity is new technology. And so now, and it's always amazing to me how quickly we absorb and just take new technology for granted, so that now we can just say, Alexa, buy me a pound of strawberries, and it can be there the next day. And then where do we get new technology from? Well, that's innovation. And that's really what our members and I think government should be spending a lot more time on than they do. Because we can have policies which have a direct impact on innovation, both accelerating innovation, but also stifling innovation. And I think the recommendations, Rob, in the report, your conclusions go and articulate a lot of the things that we can do to accelerate innovation. And I have personally a history of being a budget curmudgeon, which I wear with pride. Yep, wear proudly. But it's absolutely right that one of the government outlays that is fully justifiable to a lot of people, as Robert pointed out, is government spending on research and development. If you're an economist, you know there's just naturally a market failure in that it's not necessarily, businesses are not necessarily going to expend a lot of money into research and development, particularly basic science, when they don't know what the outcome is going to be. And the report, for instance, talks about spillover effects and other ways in which more spending on research and development benefits society as a whole. So despite that, we still have businesses just in the basic science area spending twice as much as government on basic research, which indicates to me that more could be done there. So not only more, but regardless of what level the government ends up spending on research and development, it can be better targeted. And I think that's another thing the report addresses, and is really the thrust of what you're saying, Rob, is let's look at where it could do the most good for society and for productivity and try and focus on those areas. Now, there were two other things I wanted to put around this, and you've mentioned one of them that I'm going to emphasize, but the first one And by the way, Business Roundtable has also looked at innovation and released a report about 9 months ago, and I put a few copies out there. But really is complementary, Rob, to a lot of things your report is talking about. But one of those is the pace of change. And Rob, you talked about just a number of areas where there's been a lot of change, will be a lot of change that's taking place, whether it's artificial intelligence and as a part of that, autonomous vehicles, genetic modification, which continues to challenge regulators, privacy information, which a lot of people forget about, is now an issue that has come to the fore, and how can companies use information about you that they get. Anyway, there are lots of areas in which regulators are challenged now, but are having a very difficult time figuring out how to make sure new technology is regulated, which it does need to be well regulated. But you look at what's happened for drones, for instance, and Federal Aviation Administration, which is used to and has years of experience and put together a regulatory process to regulate airplanes that have pilots in them, continues to be stressed by how to regulate drones, which do not, and of course come in much smaller sizes. I think this is something that the administration has talked about trying to address, but a lot more needs to be done there. And I just point out, for instance, that if you looked at the body of regulations that the federal government has put out, approximately 70% of them have not been updated since they were originally published. And perhaps we should be spending more time looking at what the regulations that are on the books and updating them than thinking about new regulations. The last thing I want to emphasize, Rob, is what you mentioned at the end. Changes in productivity, I think, in the long run, obviously benefit everyone, but there is disruption, which is caused, whether it's robots or something else, causing disruption, having people lose their jobs or being displaced. And that has to be dealt with very carefully. It's something that, again, the CEOs at BRT are very aware of and think needs to be carefully thought through and addressed. There are recommendations in your report, Rob, that I think are important. One thing I would emphasize, and that, again, the members of BRT or Business Roundtable are very interested in, is the education and workforce system. A lot of our CEOs would like to be expanding their business, but are having difficulty finding people to hire. So, as you mentioned, we are in a good situation, but a lot of that comes from the skill set of workers. That needs to progress and improve. And so, as does just the education system, whether it's pre-K, K through 12, or afterwards. One of the things that we've been working on, just as an example, are workforce partnership initiatives. We have 10 of them throughout the country. There'll be more, from Palo Alto to Research Triangle Park, where companies are getting together with educational institutions and often local government to create a program which will educate and graduate students in areas where we know it aligns with where the future jobs are. And so, for instance, Lockheed Martin put together a program with Bowie State University, where there are now other companies involved in it, on cybersecurity. So there's a cybersecurity institute at Bowie State paid for by companies. The faculty and the infrastructure, Bowie State runs it, and we now have about 20, it will continue to increase, about 20 graduates a year who are experts in cybersecurity. They're not guaranteed a job at Northrop Grumman. Northrop Grumman isn't guaranteed to be able to hire them, but you now have a pipeline of students with a skill set that those companies know they need. And we've been doing that more and more throughout the country. It's been quite successful. Well, that's enough of the advertising. But I look forward to any other questions, particularly defending the budget aspect of your proposals, Rob. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Marcus. Jeff.
Rob, thank you. Again, I'm Jeff Patterson, Chief Operating Officer of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. I did not bring my pocket protector with me today, but I did bring some prepared remarks to speak out very much in favor of an increase in federal funding for R&D as a key driver of productivity. And I'd like to give you some practical examples of how that is the case. However, first, let me just give you a little background on ASME. We're a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 1880. Our mission is to advance and disseminate and apply engineering knowledge throughout the world to make the world a better and safer place. We have more than 100,000 members in more than 100 countries. and another 10,000 non-member subject matter experts who contribute research insight as well. Now, we're primarily known for safety standards, and we've published more than 550 standards during the time of our existence, the most famous of which is our Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, which was published in 1915. How many of you are familiar with the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code? A couple of you. Okay, well, let me ask another question then. How many of you took a shower this morning? Well, very good. I wasn't meaning to question the hygiene of the people in the room, but rather to show the ubiquity of the work that our volunteers do. To take that shower, we depend on a hot water heater that operates safely and reliably, thanks in no small part to that Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code. The standard was created by academic and industry experts who devote hundreds of hours each year to ASME volunteer committees, and I want to underscore volunteer committees, focused on the continuous refinement of this standard, which specifies quality for the design and manufacturing of this equipment. If you've ridden an elevator, many of you may have ridden an elevator just to get to this floor. In the past week or during the course of your lifetime, your ride was made safer because of a standard created by ASME. And if you, on your commute, you see a construction crane looming above you in the air, that too is governed by safety standards created by the volunteer subject matter experts who donate their time to create safety standards that make the world a better place. So throughout our daily lives, there are many ways in which our life and work are safer and more productive, thanks to equipment made possible by breakthroughs in engineering research. At ASME, we advance and disseminate knowledge by providing new engineering research findings through 34 scholarly journals and more than 50 technical conferences and events. The insights we publish are the product of research by nearly 11,000 journal authors and more than 19,000 conference paper authors. We help other organizations apply this breakthrough knowledge by convening many forums in which researchers and technical professionals come together to address the practical challenges encountered in putting those breakthroughs to work. This includes advances that lead to improved productivity in measurable ways. Let's take robotics, for example, and Rob spoke about robotics as a force for productivity improvement. At ASME, 10 of our 30 technical conferences contribute research insight to the development of robotic solutions in a variety of applications. 4 of our scholarly journals do so as well. And in a couple of weeks' time, I'll be hosting a 2-day forum on robotics for inspection and maintenance at Texas A&M. This event will consist of seminars and hands-on demonstrations of how drones and other unmanned autonomous vehicles can perform inspections and maintenance in places that are time-consuming, expensive, and even dangerous for humans to carry out. So what does this have to do with productivity? Well, safety concerns can have a big impact on productivity. Legacy inspection methods require that an oil tank out of service is out of service for an average of 52 days. From an operating cost perspective, that single oil tank out of commission due to extended physical inspections conducted by humans can result in lost revenue of anywhere from $250,000 a year to tens of millions of dollars a year. And a safety mishap in what is known as a confined space entry, which is a formal way of saying the guy gets in the tank physically, can cost as much as $10 million in a single mishap. Online tank inspection by autonomous unmanned vehicles can and does reduce out-of-time service to less than a single day. As a result, plant owners have now begun to realize the benefits of conducting inspections using UAVs, improved personnel safety, eliminating costs, and of course, reducing plant downtime. Those are also key factors in increasing productivity. And while we're talking about safety, imagine the risk to people who are inspecting and repairing 200-foot-tall cell towers or 500-foot-tall cooling plant towers. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 887 U.S. workers fell to their deaths while on the job in 2017. To address these safety and productivity threats, cellular service providers such as AT&T have pioneered the use of drones to inspect installations and, as a result, have eliminated thousands of potentially hazardous tower climbs per year, looking after the safety of their employees and, in the bargain, improving productivity. Today at ASME, the Standards Committee is working hard on guidelines and standards for the use of aerial vehicles in power plant inspection so that this safety and productivity enhancing technology can be used with confidence by all operators in that industry. These are just a few of the many, many ways in which breakthroughs in engineering research can and do lead to improvements in safety and productivity. We believe increased federal funding for this kind of research will spur even greater productivity gains. We at ASME are glad to literally be at the table today to participate in the discussion about how that increased funding can lead to substantial productivity gains.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. That was great. Celia.
Thanks. I'm Celia Mertzbacher. I am Associate Director of the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, a new consortium of stakeholders that was called for in legislation that was passed last December, the National Quantum Initiative Act, which tasked Nist with establishing this consortium. So the QEDC is a relatively new entity, and we're in the process, we're sort of in a startup phase. It's being managed through a contract with SRI International, and so what I thought I would do is I have sort of 3 points that I wanted to make here. So I'll do the good thing. I'll say what the points are, I'll tell you about them, and then I'll repeat them so you'll remember them. So number one, and I'm really keying off of this report, which if you haven't already had a chance to take a look at it, I commend it to you. I think everybody should read it thoroughly. Some of the elements of it that I really resonated with because of my background both at SRI and with this new consortium and my previous life in an industry consortium out of the semiconductor industry was the call for more of these types of consortia that bring together the different parts of the research ecosystem. So you can kind of think of the research community as being made up of the folks at universities doing basic research, discovery research, educating students and the future workers in the process, and funded largely by agencies like the National Institutes of Health and NSF and Department of Energy's Office of Science and DoD. Those are sort of the big ones that fund university research. And so you've got universities, you've got industry researchers, and Gil is going to tell you more about Intel, and of course there used to be organizations like Bell Labs and much more research going on at industry. So today those efforts are being contracted somewhat, integrated more into the product side of the house, and so there is a really important component there, but its flavor is much more towards development. And then you have the government, and you've got government labs, and you've got government investors at the agencies. So bringing together all 3 parts, government, university, and industry, is a fertile way to enhance the output and the results and the uptake of those research results by industry. It really takes connections and contact among the people who are part of those organizations. So examples of entities that successfully do that include the Semiconductor Research Corporation, where I used to be. It's been around since the early 80s, and it's an organization that was created by industry, for industry, partners with the government, invests in universities. So it's living at the nexus of all 3 parts of the ecosystem. And it's a win-win-win. It's a win for government because they're partnering with industry and they're learning what industry needs and they're able to invest more wisely in a sense. They're informed when they make those investment decisions. It's a win for the universities, and I really saw the benefits, especially for students, because they were seeing what life after their academic career was going to be like by having interactions on a regular basis with people from the industry sponsors. And the faculty too. They get up, they want to do something useful when they do their work. They have a much better sense of what's needed, and they're not just publishing and then moving on there. They're actually interacting with the customer, if you will, the user of the results. And then for the industry folks, they're having access to all of this talent. They're hiring the students when they graduate. They're getting to know the faculty. If they have a basic research problem that they can't address in-house, they can go to the university of whatever and probably find somebody who can help. And so it's enormously enhancing of the productivity of the research. And it's not natural. It's not normal for industries to work with each other to fund things, and it's not really normal, and there's sort of what an engineer would call an impedance mismatch. The universities are working on the academic calendar year, the PhD is graduating in 3 to 4 years, et cetera. Industry wants results tomorrow, and so it's not normal or natural for them to work together. So you have to really encourage it and make it worthwhile, and that's where things like tax policies and other incentives can really help. Because at the end of the day, it's enormously valuable. The QEDC is another version of this, and the manufacturing institutes that were mentioned are also an example of where government's funding a consortium of industry partners to come together to find some common goals that are needed and then go out and address them. So there's a real application-driven aspect to it. So that's one thing, government, university, industry consortia. The second thing is nonprofit R&D centers. SRI International, some of you may have heard of, many perhaps not. SRI International is really a sort of an outgrowth of World War II activity, and there are others. So there are organizations like the Research Triangle Institute down in North Carolina, HRL, Battelle, there are FFRDCs like Lincoln Labs that are doing contract R&D. They live and die by successfully proposing and getting funds from agencies and commercial entities to do research. So they have to be very competitive. They aren't just counting on a paycheck coming every month. They need to be out there coming up with ideas and selling them. And so they're very nimble, they have expertise that's different from universities, and they play a very important role in this whole R&D ecosystem. And I think sometimes they're left out, so I just wanted to sort of mention the important role. They tend to complement universities, do more advanced or higher TRL work, higher technology readiness level work, in the valley of death between the basic research and the more applied work. They're more naturally multidisciplinary, and they tend to work more at a system level. So again, very complementary to universities. And then the third point I wanted to make was, what are the agencies? Here, many of you are with government. Which agencies are the ones that are most likely to, I think, be important in implementing some of the ideas that this report is making? Well, you've got the National Science Foundation. They're investing a lot in R&D. I think, I didn't look it up, but if you looked at their budget, actually the biggest parts of the National Science Foundation are the Computer and Information Science and Engineering section, or directorate, and the Engineering Directorate. Those are very applied. Within NSF, they're among the most applied parts of the organization. So, in fact, I think they are investing quite heavily in areas that are relevant to the goals of this study. It's, I think, always a challenge to change the way that the bureaucracies work. And so I commend the report again for making some suggestions. I will remind you that NSF does have two criteria that are evaluated when they look at a proposal. One is the technical and scientific merit, and the other is the broader impact. And broader impact is broad. It's sort of the part that's other than the discovery and advancement of knowledge and science. And it includes education, outreach to perhaps underrepresented groups, trying to build up the STEM pipeline with K-12 and so on. And perhaps broader impact at NSF could include, how much is this going to impact productivity? Add that to the criteria that are included in that area where you can include that because every proposal has to include a broader impact. So NSF is obviously one agency. Another, which I'm not sure is mentioned, but I'm going to wave the flag, is Nist. Nist is in the Department of Commerce. It's a relatively small agency. It punches way above its weight. It's involved with standards. It's the funding sponsor initially in the government of the QEDC because it's about increasing productivity. It's in the Department of Commerce. It's about U.S. industry. So it's a natural partner here. And so I would encourage finding ways to get the folks at Nist involved because they get it. This would be a natural fit for them. And then I just have sort of one little PS, and again, this is sort of a policy issue. I'm working now in this area, quantum, which is very emergent. And there's a lot of concern, and it's not just in quantum, in emerging technologies in general. Be careful how export controls are implemented. It's an issue that's being addressed right now by the export control folks over in the Department of Commerce. It's, I'm sure, a subject of discussion on the Hill. But I think it's important that we get it right with that and not stifle innovation by overly controlling the export of some of these technologies and worrying about the national security applications when there are so many non-military uses that are going to be really important for the economy. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sue. Gil.
Hi, I'm Gil Vanentop. I work for Intel, and I'm the Director of Corporate University Research, and I'm also on the SRC Board of Directors. So it's kind of funny, Celia and I had offices right next to each other for several years in North Carolina. And a lot of what I have to say will resonate with what Celia just said. Corporate University Research at Intel, it's basically the responsibility for pulling together all of our investments at universities. We use this as our technology pipeline, our hiring pipeline, and our new idea pipeline. Right? It's kind of an extension of the research that we do internally.
Gil, can you make sure if your mic is working? I don't know if you, or get closer maybe.
Okay, how's that?
That better, thank you.
Okay.
Great.
And Celia described SRC. I mean, SRC does a great job of gathering industry and the government agencies and academia together to assemble large research programs and manage them effectively. So I did an assignment there for about 5 years running a program, and now I serve on the board of directors, and I mean, Intel takes great advantage of the company and how they do business in the research area. I have a lot of productive experience with public partnerships. I ran the EEV program for Intel for a long time when it was in the research phase, and we got really good support from the national labs. We got good support from Nist. I think we got good support from Sematech while it existed, which was, I think, started by DOD and then also supported by state funding. So that went on for a long time. Actually, the national labs are still supporting the EEV program, and I'm hoping to engage them more in that area. So that was a good example. When I was at SRC, I was the director of StarNet, and currently there's this follow-on program called JUMP, and that's a DARPA funded program. DARPA pays a fraction, and multiple companies are participating in that. Defense companies like Intel, IBM, Micron. There's 14 companies in all, and that's a very effective program. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And it has a sister program also within SRC called NCORE, and that's supported by Nist and NSF. And it uses the same model for this three-way partnership. So sort of my message resonates with everyone else. What everyone else is saying is we need more spending. SIA put out a report recently recommending a 3 times increase in spending. The emphasis that I'd like to put on is it's just as important how you spend that money as it is how much you spend. And so that's where, I go back to the SRC model, where if you bring together U.S. government and a group of companies to fund academic research, you provide a foundation that the companies can build on. And that's what Intel's done over the years. I think DARPA is an especially good example because not only do they fund the foundation of the research, what companies do, that's all pre-competitive, right? So we all work together. SRC enables that. We set the priorities, we agree on the priorities, and we all benefit from the work, but it's open to everybody, right? And we're good with that because we invest in the pillars that go on top of the foundation to give us a competitive advantage, right? And then we build our business on top of those pillars. So that structure is sort of how we do business and how we take advantage of that. And the DARPA ERI, it's the Electronics Resurgence Initiative. So DARPA has taken a step forward to actually also invest in pillars, right? They invested in the foundation. They align their pillars, with their specific needs, but that aligns actually very well with Intel's interests, for example, and many other companies, right? And that also brings together companies like Lockheed Martin and Intel and academia. They form those types of partnerships on very specific projects which drive one of these pillars upwards. So that model, I think, is very effective. The research has clear deliverables, right? A clear timeline in terms of when to deliver, and a strong focus on tech transfer. So it's not just academic research, it's very focused on tech transfer, which benefits the U.S. industry. I mean, I think there is room to grow. There could be more U.S. industry partnership. On top of that foundation and those pillars, there are many companies who have benefited that really weren't building at the time. Companies like Facebook, Apple, Google, they all grew out of that structure, right? And I'd like to engage more of those companies in this type of work. I'd like to see the national labs engaged more. Intel actually has a good relationship with national labs in terms of getting specific research vectors supported. But what I think is missing, a program like the JUMP program doesn't take advantage of the national labs that much. They're quite independent, right? When we had the EV program, we very much took advantage of the national lab capability, and like I said, we still do. I mean, they built infrastructure specifically to take measurements that were necessary, pre-competitive space once again, but they were necessary for that program. And then, it's the engagement of all the U.S. government agencies that fund research. So that's always a struggle, right? We kind of have to break things apart. SRC does, the companies do. I should mention, Intel has a good relationship with the National Science Foundation, a little bit of a different model, but Intel shares, like we just did this, we're doing our selection process for our investments for next year. We had a long list, we made it a short list, we're sending that list to NSF, they look it over and they say, oh, here's the areas that we're interested in, and we do joint proposals. Intel, for every dollar Intel puts in, NSF puts in a dollar. If they really like it, sometimes they go 2 to 1. But we have a good communication channel, and we make these investments. They appreciate the fact that we manage these investments closely. And they don't really have the resources to do the management. They do the selection and they do the funding, and they do participate in the management. But when they see how much industry guides the research, then they can take a step back. So those are the priorities that I'd like to communicate, and that's the model that I really support.
Great, thank you. I want to open it up to you all for any questions or comments you might have, but let me just ask the panelists one thing. By the way, my first job out of grad school was at Nist, so I have great admiration and fondness for Nist. We didn't really get into sort of agency details in this. I would see any kind of, if there was a plus-up along the lines we're talking about, I would see it going, to places like Nist and DOE and DOD and certainly NSF, certainly NIH as well. Agriculture is another place. People forget about that. There's all these interesting technologies in agriculture that could play a big role, and DOA funds almost nothing in this space. So we're sort of agnostic on agencies. I did want to ask each of you, though, maybe Mark, if you can take a pass on this, but feel free to jump in. What's kind of one area in your area of interest or expertise that when you're looking out, what's kind of one technology area or application that you are most excited about in terms of productivity potential? So maybe Jeff, start with you. You can do like Dustin Hoffman did and just say plastics.
Or mechanical engineering, and we're done. Well, again, I think in addition to robotics, we see a host of opportunities in additive manufacturing for investment that can bridge that gap between the basic insights that the researchers initially come up with into applied research and then commercialization. And one of the things that we see is that there are other nations who shall go unnamed who are making significant investments in that basic research in those key emerging technologies, AI being another. And they, of course, have a vertically integrated industrial policy. I'm not advocating for that in the United States, but I think we would do well to recognize that in each of these key areas, additive manufacturing, robotics, AI, we are not alone. We don't have the research playing field to ourselves, and we would do well to think about the larger competitive implications. A lot of work being done in AI in China and in other parts of the world. And I can tell you that AI is increasingly informing the basic definition of what a mechanical engineer does, how we approach design, how we look at the model-based enterprise, and go from basically drawings on paper to imagining a whole new way of conceiving of systems and equipment within those systems. AI ties that all together.
Yeah, we've written a lot about that. Companies like Autodesk, for example, are using AI to come up with what's called generative design, where you sort of put these inputs in and come up with a design you never would have designed by a human.
Right.
And then, on the additive one, one of the things I was surprised when we did this work was there's an enormous array of technical and scientific challenges in additive that we haven't solved by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, we can print out plastics pretty well, but there's a lot of other things, materials and all these other things, which it's not my expertise, so there's a lot of work that could be done there.
If I can just follow up on materials, glad you mentioned that, because even in something as seemingly mundane as a boiler, the use of new materials, particularly in high-pressure applications associated with nuclear installations, is an area of real focus for us. Increasingly, our engineers are having to learn about material science. They're working closely with material scientists. So once again, mechanical engineers don't do their work in a vacuum. They're increasingly working collaboratively with people from other engineering and technical disciplines, and material science is certainly one of them.
So it's okay if you say quantum, but...
First, I'm going to say material. Turn that off. First, I'm going to echo the materials piece because it kind of gets no respect sometimes, and they're a part of everything. So you mentioned, some sort of mundane-sounding applications, tires, and all kinds of uses of materials are extremely sophisticated, and the products are being improved by advances in materials. I will, of course, say quantum. I think that's an exciting area, and I started 15 years ago with the Nanotechnology Initiative, and this quantum initiative is being modeled in some ways on the Nano Initiative for good reasons. I think the Nano Initiative did a good job in a lot of ways of taking this emerging technology from the total research phase out into some very important applications. Quantum is intimidating. I'm going to make myself available to meet with any of you and talk to you more about it. I'm not going to explain the laws of physics to you today, but it's really going from a fundamental area of research that's been going on for decades, really came out of the work of people like Einstein 100 years ago, but now is being made possible by advances not only in quantum physics and quantum engineering, but in classical technologies like photonics, and microwave technologies, and the ability to cool things to very, very low temperatures. This is not the quantum part of it, but it's peripheral, and it's part of what this consortium is about. I also want to emphasize the importance of convergence, so I'm not going to pick a single winner in a way, but getting back to this idea of systems where you're bringing together AI and the IT piece, the digital components, some materials and ability to 3D manufacture. I think the convergence of all these things is going to be where a lot of the exciting new applications and products come from. And I guess if I had to emphasize one thing that gets me very excited is regenerative medicine. So the idea of 3D printing organs and parts as we have this aging population, I think that is an area where the advances are going to have enormous value for the country and the world. So.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there is a advanced manufacturing institute on regenerative medicine and organ printing. So we'll print our house, and then we'll get older, and we'll print the organs.
Yeah.
So, go.
I'm going to kind of pile on to the quantum argument. My kids ask me sometimes now that, it's like, you've been working at Intel for 29 years. It's like, aren't you ready to retire? I mean, aren't you getting bored? And this is a hyperbole, but what I tell them is, well, the way I see, the next few years going forward is Intel solves quantum computing solves chemistry, and chemistry solves global warming. It's like, why would I retire now, right? That's not my answer, but it's one of my favorite exaggerations. My answer actually is efficient computing devices, right? That's what we do, and it ties into AI, but it ties into many of these vectors. But to enable efficient computation at the edge of the Internet of Things, as we add sensors across all parts of business and regular life, and be able to pull the information out of those sensors that we can afford to send over the limited bandwidth that we have And that information will enable productivity gains across the board, right? So, but it does come down to materials enabling efficient devices.
Marcus, do you have
Yeah, well,
as a
30 seconds.
scientist,
Well,
social scientist?
as a former professional engineer, I like to keep
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
There you go.
I like to
My
keep up with
apologies.
things. But, and actually, this comes more from my daughter, who's in this area. But it's neuroscience. And the ability now to map the brain and do it quickly reminds me where genomics was not that long ago. To both, and you combine that with embedded technology to both be able to read what people are thinking and affect what people are thinking is going to be fascinating. If that sounds crazy, just think about cochlear implants, which have been around for a while. There's all kinds of things you could do with that technology, some of them scary, some of them extremely beneficial.
Great. Okay, thank you. All right, so I want to open it up, and I think if I'll go here, but if you can just, I don't know if we can get a mic. All right, great.
I promise I'll speak loudly. I'm Mark Walsh, and for the last 15 months of the prior administration, I ran investment relations at the SBA. A quick shout out to the SBIR program that I found valuable. But my question is, one area of innovation that was not touched on, interested in the panel's reaction, is education. I know we talk about removing those folks who lose their job because of innovation. But my sense is that higher education hasn't changed much in a century or so. And I know there's lots of heat around changing how we regroup and retrain and re-engage folks who lose their jobs because of innovation. But what are you guys seeing that are really tactical ways that we are actually finding ways to rapidly, efficiently, and productivity regroup folks who are losing their jobs because of innovation and getting them back in the workforce because education is still so siloed and still.
We can use your example. When you in the Matrix, you can just plug in the back of your brain and learn how to fly a helicopter. That's to me the best, but that's a little bit ways
give
off.
That
but-
idea to my daughter, Rob. No, actually, I do see it in the reskilling area. So a lot of our companies want to reskill workers. There's a lot of activity going on in that area, and they're using new technology and new ways to do that. And particularly, there's a feedback loop because they're able to also measure retention of employees that go through different types of training programs, and then just the performance. And so they retool the curricula as well as the teaching methods based on, I've seen this mostly so far in the utility area, utilities for technicians and others, where they will go back within months and change how they're retraining workers so that they're safer, can be retained, do a more efficient job. So I see greater resistance in areas where you're running into sort of traditional established educational systems, but less so where you're not.
All right, I think here, by the way, just as a commercial for that, we have a report on our team will be coming out on SBI reform, kind of modeled after the NSF model, and I think we're releasing it in a couple of weeks up here on the hill somewhere.
And I just want to add a comment on the education sort of stack and emphasize the role of community colleges, especially in the workers that maybe are going to be most disrupted and displaced. In the quantum area, which has been the domain of PhD physicists, there is an interest in upskilling the existing engineering workforce to take people who aren't in school but have already are out in the workforce and give them some skills that they're going to need to be able to participate in that. And I think that professional societies will play a big role because they do a lot of education in that space.
Yeah, if I may, I live in Connecticut, and Connecticut is a heavily manufacturing-oriented state. There is a program to train manufacturing technicians aligned with the community college network. And the program is quite rigorous. They actually can't find enough students who will complete the 2-year program, but every one of those students who complete that program have multiple job offers. Another element to education that I would point out is that the technology is changing so rapidly that even degreed technical professionals will have to retrain themselves several times over the course of their careers. I've seen data that suggests that a millennial entering the workforce today will have 13 different jobs before he or she retires. A lot of that is going to, in the technical world, is going to require significant skills acquisition and refresh over the course of their careers. So we ought not to assume that the typical line worker is the only person who will face the challenge of reskilling during the course of their career.
Well, and some of the technology vectors that we're working on go to that, right? I mean, you said, yeah, we haven't changed the way we teach in a long time, and that's true, but we're working on augmented reality, right? Artificial intelligence will inform the way, and pattern recognition of facial expressions, right? If you have a feedback loop there, then that will change the way we teach, and it'll be much more productive in terms of retraining.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the report. I've only been able to skim it, getting it a few minutes ago, but I was glad that you mentioned genetic engineering, but I don't really see it in the report, and it surprises me. We talk about, you mentioned molecular, but you don't actually talk about genetic engineering, because to me, a lot of people think of genetic engineering in the health industry, but it's not just that, right? We're talking about agriculture, which you mentioned. We're talking about materials development, talking like the self-healing cement, bacteria that you can put in with the cement that when it is a crack, it would actually, the oxygen that comes in would make it grow and heal. And also like computing, I mean, storing information in cells and using DNA for information storage. So there's a lot that can be done there. I forgot to say, my name is Carolina Peñalba. I'm a Brookings Fellow, Legislative Fellow. I'm an EPA employee in my normal day job. And one of my areas of expertise is the regulation of genetic engineered products. And so I was also surprised when you said that 70% of regulations haven't been updated. I was hoping it would be less than that.
Well, it's actually 68, I got to admit it, right?
Right. but it's high. And we do see a challenge with innovative technology coming in, how to regulate that. And we've noticed that whoever's first to regulate something, if it's the US or the EU, a lot of countries follow that.
Right.
And so it's very important for us to stay ahead, to be able to come up with regulations for these new innovations. So I was wondering what proposals, or if there's a new report that's going to come out with some ideas on how to leverage innovations and those expertise with the people that are involved in writing these regulations.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, we see, genetic engineering, whether it's in materials or for new energy, wide array of things, applications as pretty critical. So if it wasn't stressed enough, it wasn't because of a lack of understanding or interest in it. But yeah, absolutely.
Well, yeah, so the OECD actually keeps track, the reason I know it's 68%, the OECD keeps track of how often OECD countries update their regulations. US is second from the bottom, Japan's the worst, but you've got Australia, United Kingdom, Germany, more than 50% of their regulations. They have a process by which they go back and follow a timeline for updating regulations, and they're purposeful about it. They think about what's going to be of most interest in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And so, for instance, in our report, that's one thing we recommend, particularly agencies that are facing these challenges now are likely to face them in the near future.
I was talking to a White House official recently, and he was explaining that they're involved in that process, particularly in HHS, and one of the things they're doing is they're using AI and text recognition. And one of the terms they put in is if the regulation includes the word telegraph, it might be due for some sort of refresh. And it turns out there's not a insignificant number of regulations that include the word telegraph. Other questions? Yes, sir, ma'am. You can use the mic if you wouldn't mind.
We've talked a little bit about targeted R&D spending, but I was wondering if you had thoughts on sort of a broader, in some ways more expansive approach to R&D spending at the national level. I think, I can't remember if this report or research out of MIT that talks about how 10% increase in federally funded R&D leads to about 3% increase in private R&D generally, regardless of how it's targeted. And so one of the things that, I work for Senator Mark Warner, and so one of the things that the senator has been focused on quite a bit is sort of, this question around the future of work and making sure that everyone at the table is sort of part of this inclusive growth approach. And so if the government is taking a leadership position on this and really sort of tackling the questions from a bottom-up approach, where we are, and funding those government university consortiums around the country, addressing place-based economic development around the country generally, and sort of building up that workforce, it actually also partners really well with sort of the business sector approach to R&D. So I was wondering if you had thoughts about that, about something a little bit more expanded as opposed to sort of targeted R&D on robotics and other things.
Well, I mean, I just jump into that. I think the focus of the report was really to say, how do we use an innovation agenda, particularly an R&D focused innovation agenda, to drive down the debt to GDP ratio? And so, there's some number of scholars in there I cite, but if you think about it from an extreme perspective, if we're going to put money into genetic engineering for materials versus studying black holes, okay, those are two competing things. I feel very safe of saying that the former is going to have a much bigger impact on U.S. productivity growth than the latter. So there's not really a question then of saying you can't figure out a way to prioritize. The question is, do we want to prioritize? And I think the point would be, we have a limited amount of money in the federal budget, and targeting it to these kind of core technology areas, maybe there's 20 or 30 of them, just seems to me that it would do the most to raise wages in the U.S. economy. One of the things in the last decade I'm always struck by, pundits are like, well, why aren't wages growing? I mean, full employment. The answer is because productivity is not growing. Wages cannot grow faster than productivity growth in terms of real wages. If you go back again, look at the 90s, we had, strong wage growth because we had strong productivity growth. So I think fundamentally, to us, raising productivity is going to be one of the key things we've got to do better as a country, and that's why we argued for the targeting. So I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that.
On a sort of separate but related to your question, thought, I guess, is, we're here in Washington, we're thinking at the federal level, but you mentioned the place-based aspect of a lot of the outcomes and the actual productization and growth in productivity. It has to happen somewhere. And so the state involvement, I think, is probably critical, and they always are focused on sort of jobs and the economic aspect, more so even. The government, has got a broader and somewhat different perspective that complements that. So I think getting the state governments involved would be helpful.
Yeah, and that the amount that's spent together with government and industry is a limiting factor in that we have more ideas on known technology vectors than we have dollars to research. And if we wanted to broaden that, a company can't really look too far afield, but with U.S. government support, academics can certainly look in a more broader scope than industry can.
I'd just add a grace note to this, that there is prioritization now. It's just not as purposeful and maybe not as transparent. I was involved in an effort to try and, I think, change priorities for water resource funding some time ago. It's appropriate we're in the T&I committee room for this statement. But what you find is part of the prioritization may be who the chairman of a particular committee is, for instance. So I think by being more purposeful, you kind of get a sense of what the current priorities are and how they may need to change, which then gets into some practical matters about implementation.
Yes, sir. Mike, you can hold up.
Thanks. My name is Jonathan Ward. I'm the author of a new book on Chinese global grand strategy called China's Vision of Victory. So when I look at this in the sort of context of the U.S.-China economic competition, which is one that I believe we have to win through productivity, I think that is the answer. The question then to me is, if you look at the U.S. Fortune 1000 as 2/3 of the U.S. economy, how do you have a greater level of collaboration between normally competitive U.S. Fortune 500s and Fortune 1000s on key strategic industries? Some of the examples that I've heard today sound really excellent, but where are we along the level at which we might need to be in order to compete with a massive economic superpower?
So one of the, just go on there, maybe Gil, you can jump in. if we look at that sort of best practice model, and I think you have to look at a place like Germany, where for over 50 years they've had a system of Fraunhofer institutes. They have about 60 of these, funded 1/3 by the government, 2/3 by industry. They regularly kick them off. If they're not performing, out they go. So they're always recycling them, but they're focused on the kind of key technology challenge areas for the German government. The Chinese government, as I said, we were involved in helping to launch what became Manufacturing USA. The Chinese government, literally their first 6 institutes were exactly the same as our first 6 institutes. The only difference is they're developing 45. We have, I think, 15 or 16, and they're putting in, again, an order of magnitude more in terms of money on that. So they see that as the model of bringing industry and academia and government together. They're just willing to, do a lot more. So, Gil, did you want to add to that?
Well, those are really good examples. I mean, Fraunhofer and IMEC in Belgium. And the difference between those institutes and say, the SRC is they have infrastructure. And so we don't have anything equivalent with that type of infrastructure. We leverage the infrastructure at universities. We don't leverage the national lab infrastructure as much as we should. I mentioned that point, right? And we could build additional national labs like the Fraunhofer Institutes that are very targeted towards industry success, right? And we don't have those. The national labs are a little bit more separate from industry technology vectors.
Yeah, and it really goes to this point. I mean, when you think about it, historically in science policy, there's sort of 2 big things. There's curiosity-directed research, which is NSF and parts of DOE Office of Science, and then there's mission-oriented. And the missions are pretty narrow. I mean, they're like defense, agriculture, health, and energy. And I really, at the sort of most broad level, the most important point we're making in this report is we need to add another mission, and that's productivity. And that would get at your point, because if we're more productive, we're going to be more competitive, not just because we have bottom line savings, but because all these technologies, whether it's quantum or whatever, robotics, hopefully we're going to be making those as well as using them, and that'll be big export markets.
Sorry, Silly.
I'd like to mention a model that I think goes to your point in your question a little bit, and that is ARPA-E. So it's a very focused agency within the Department of Energy that is trying to move the needle in a very conservative, for good reason, industry. You don't build a nuclear power plant overnight. They don't get rebuilt. There's not a Moore's law there that's sort of regenerating things so quickly. So things have to be built to last. They have to be safe. And there are a lot of areas and yet the government's not the customer. So the government's investing research for an industry that's got to use the results and implement them. And I think studying how that's working and using it in other spaces might be worth taking a look at. I mean, the construction industry you mentioned, very conservative, very distributed. It's not going to come together and make a consortium like the semiconductor industry. It just doesn't make sense. So, is there a way for government to invest in technology solutions that can somehow then be diffused out into those industries and have a big impact?
Just on that point, it's interesting because the Europeans have a construction technology consortium they're putting a lot of money into in order to raise productivity in European construction. We have one in the U.S. called FIATech. We've got Semitech, we've got FIATech. There's no government money. The government refused to invest in FIATech, even though the Europeans have one, the Koreans have one, and it wasn't a lot of money. It was, and these companies, but again, it goes to Gil's point, if government's not at the table, it's a lot harder for industry to be at the table. So, okay, Gil, did you want to comment on that at all? Or?
Well, maybe just to extend, the metaphor that I was trying to communicate is, the government is investing in the foundation. Industry is investing in the pillars. The problem is that foundation is available across the globe, right? And so others can build on that foundation. And if we don't invest in the pillars here, then others will take advantage of that foundation. So one of these institutes with infrastructure would be able to help us do that.
Absolutely. Any last comment or question? Okay, good. Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, everybody. First of all, I want to thank you all for joining us, and please join me in thanking a great panel today.